Hi, I'm Jim Linnell with Tandy Leather. I'm going to be showing you how to make a wallet, and I'll be going through each of the steps with each of the tools in enough detail so that you'll know how to get the best results out of your leatherwork. Now that all of our leather stamping is finished, we've let this leather completely dry out, and that's one of the rules that is good to follow when you're putting your stains on your leather. They all work best if you'll let your leather completely dry out. So we've let this dry out overnight so that there's no moisture left in it. It's ready to dye the background. We're going to do a several step process to this. It's often called inlay dyeing is what I'm going to do. We're going to color the background with a dark colored stain, and which will really cause this design to stand out. The product that I'm going to use is called water stain, and I'm just going to use a medium brown color here. It'll give us a lot of contrast. It'll really bring out the natural tones in the leather. And I find this to be a really good type of stain to use for this sort of dye work. And I'm going to put some of this in my dish here so that I have easy access to it. So we'll put a little bit of it in there. And then using just a medium-sized brush, I don't know what number that is, but something that you could bring to a fairly good point, we'll just use a brush and lay that dye in there. When we're putting the dye on the brush, show you here, I do put quite a bit of dye in the brush initially because I want the dye to feed down the brush as we're working here so that it doesn't just stay on the very end of it. So I'll put a good bit of dye in it, and then we'll start working on the leather. The couple of important things about using these type of dyes, these are translucent. That is, they allow a little bit of the color of the leather to come through. This here is pretty dark, so there's not a lot of that, but when you use this type of a dye, if you were to put this color on a piece of white paper, it would give you a little different tone than it's going to on this natural colored veg tan leather. So just be aware of that when you're using this dye. One of the things on this dry leather, this product is called water stain, and it is a water-based product, and it does penetrate into the leather really well, especially this dry leather. But one of the things when you're dyeing in the background on something like this, you'll notice that I didn't start right up close to the edge. I start out in the larger middle of it, and then as I get a little less dye coming off of my brush, I'll work up closer to those edges. Sometimes, although this water stain doesn't do it quite as bad as some of the solvent-based dyes, but sometimes your dye will hit the leather and it'll soak in and it'll spread a little bit. Like I said, the water stain doesn't do that quite so much as some of the other solvent-based dyes, but it works really well. And you just have to be very careful with this. You have to take your time and be very deliberate about where you're putting that color on there. Don't get in a hurry and try to get too large a brush and do this with a real quick pass. You want to take whatever time it takes to make sure that you've got this well covered, and just go about it very deliberately. As you work into these small pointed corners, these gaps and these openings between the design, make sure that you have your brush angled so that the point reaches in there and don't have the rest of the brush dragging stain across something you don't want stain on. And there's just really, again, no speedy way to do this, but it makes such a difference. You can already see what a contrast this is giving our piece of leather, how much it's making those leaves and everything stand out. And this will, like I said, take you a little bit of time, so just work at it. You notice I am having to add more color to my brush on a pretty regular basis. And you'll also notice I turn it around quite a bit, and the reason for that is so I can point my brush up into some of these narrow little openings like this, so that it's just reaching in there with the very tip of the brush. You want to be careful with this. This is a really good stain, and if it should get somewheres on your piece of leather that you don't want it, it doesn't come out. This is a permanent stain. It stays in the leather really well. I have told this to some others that are avid leather workers, been at this for a long time, but this water stain, it's a newer product in the leatherworking market, and having done leatherwork myself for 45 years or so, I think this is the best stain that leatherworkers have ever had available to them. The colors go on nice and rich. They are consistent. It stays where you put it. It doesn't rub off. And if you talk to somebody that's done a lot of leather work for a long period of time, they can tell you some horror stories about colors rubbing off and or fading out and such. And you just have really good results with this stain. So don't be afraid to try it. It goes a long ways too. So once again, just take whatever amount of time it takes you to do a real clean, careful job with this. Be careful. You notice I've got a piece of paper towel underneath my project while I'm working on it. Sometimes if I were going into a small area and it looks like I got too much stain on my brush, I'll brush off some of that excess so that I have just a little bit there. That way no mistakes are going to happen. So that's part of the reason I have the paper towel there, just to be able to control what that dye is doing. There are some confusion, and we'll explain it a little bit more when we get to the antiquing step that we do, but stains and antiques and dyes all sound like maybe they do the same thing, but they really do different things with the leather. And we're going to use, on this project here, we're going to use an antique type of finish. We're using the water stain, which is really a dye, for this part here. And then, of course, we'll be using a sealer as well. So you'll see as we do this project what the different results are that each one presents. As you can see, we've done the inlay dyeing and all of the background areas. You want to check your project over real carefully. I have missed places before, so make sure that you look it over real carefully. Make sure you've not left one of these little places missing. It looks pretty weird when you do that, and it's hard to go back after you put the finish on. And this piece has dried overnight. We put the color on there, give it plenty of drying time. And again, that's one of the basic rules when you're doing dyeing and finishing and so forth, is make sure that you give plenty of time between each of these steps to let the previous step completely dry before you go on to the next one. So what we're going to do next is we're going to put a sealer over this. We're going to this will be the first stage of doing the final coloring. The product that we're going to use is Super Sheen. I find that Super Sheen is probably the best resistor that there is, and I call it a resistor because we're going to put an antique finish over the top of it, and it will keep that antique from penetrating into the leather. But we need a good finish on there first. So we're going to use Super Sheen to do that. There are several ways that you can do this. It's a clear acrylic finish, and so there's several ways you could apply it. One method that is often used is using some daubers. That works pretty good. I don't like daubers too much. Sometimes the little fibers and such will leave some hairs on your project. One of the other things that gets used sometimes is a piece of sheep's wool. Sheep's wool has been used by saddle makers forever, applying finishes and such, because they have plenty of these scraps left over around their shop, so it works really good for applying that. But once again, at least sometimes these little fibers will be embedded in the finish on there, and so it'll leave some of that residue behind. So the product that I like to use, or the means I like to use to apply this, is one of these high density sponges. These work really good. They don't leave any bubbling or any of those kind of issues in your finish. That goes on nice and smooth, and it doesn't leave any of those residues behind. And this sponge here, I took and dampened it first, just to soften it up mostly. The moisture doesn't, I wrung all of the moisture out of it, but I did soften it up. That allows it to conform to the tooled leather there a little bit. So when we get ready to put the finish on, we put a pretty liberal finish, or pretty liberal coat of this super sheen on there, and I just take and get a good amount of it into the sponge. And then using a circular motion, I'll work that finish into the leather, and just make sure that you get a good consistent coat. Because we're going to be putting an antique sort of finish over the top of this, I'm going to probably put a couple of coats on here, and so we need to get this first one on and let it dry, and then we'll come back and put a second coat on before we actually, and let it dry before we go back and use the antique finish. So goes on. It's kind of a milky looking product like that, but when it dries, it'll dry nice and clear, and it'll give us a real nice finish. And really, that's all we would have to do to this piece of leather. That would protect it, that would make it somewhat water resistant. That's all that really needs to be done to this piece of leather. But I've found that using an antique type of finish over the top of that helps to bring out some of the carving and some of the details that we put into it. Our first coat of super sheen has pretty well dried on this, on our wallet back, so let's put a second coat on there. This coat doesn't have to be nearly as heavily applied as the first coat, so just a little bit this time. And but again, make sure we get it over everything, and we'll let that one dry, and we'll be ready for the antique finish. We're now ready for a really important step, which is I've been referring to as the antiquing step. And let me explain again what we've done so far. We've dyed the background with medium brown water stain. Let that dry overnight. Then we came back and we put a coat of super sheen on, a pretty heavy coat. We let that dry, and then we put a second coat on, a light coat, and we've let that dry. And so now we're going to put an antique effect to it. And the product I'm going to use is called Highlighter. Highlight is a antique type of finish, and what an antique does is it settles down into all of the cuts and impressions that you put into the leather, and it leaves them darker. And normally if we had an unsealed piece of leather, it would stain the entire piece of leather, whatever color that highlight stain is. But since we have put a resist finish on there of super sheen, it will keep that highlight from staining everything, but it will still settle into all of the cuts and impressions, and hopefully bring out a lot of the detail that we've carved into this piece of leather. Highlight is an acrylic type of a finish. The color that I'm using is called briar brown. It leaves a nice warm color in the leather as well. But we'll put this on now and see what this does for this piece of leather. To apply this, I'm going to use the high density sponge again. This is, in fact, the same sponge I've been using for the super sheen. You can wash this out when you're using these acrylic finishes, so you get a lot of use out of them. And I'm going to put this highlight on fairly liberally. You can see I can put quite a glob of it on there, and then I'm going to put it on all over this piece of leather. I want to make sure that there's enough on there so that it gets down into every cut, every impression, every mark that I put into the leather. I want to make sure that it's got a good amount of the highlight worked down into it. This is how we achieve that antique effect. Make sure that it's well penetrated, and then about as soon as I get it on there and get it worked down into everything, I'm going to take a paper towel and I'm going to remove the excess. And the reason I use a paper towel for removing the excess is, again, I don't want some sort of a fiber to lift that color out of all of those cuts and impressions. And you can see that the piece of leather is for the most part staying that original color that it was, but it's got a lot of contrast now. This highlight settles down into all of the pear shading. Remember, we used a pear shader that had a line texture. We used a beveler that had a checkered texture. We used you know, the veiners and camouflage those. You can see how that color collects down in to all of those impressions that we made, and it really provides a lot of depth. It brings out all of the details of the design that we've carved into this piece of leather. So we'll let that dry a little bit, and then we'll come back with a dampened paper towel, and we'll go over it and we'll remove a little bit more, but we need to let this dry just a little bit. But you can already see how much additional contrast. See how it brings out all of the cuts and impressions and everything that we've stamped into this piece of leather. It really makes them stand out. Once this dries, we'll have to remove this piece of cardboard from the back of it as well, so it will be ready then to start assembly. Thank you for joining me today. Be sure and check back often here at our blog, and we'll show you more tips and ideas on how to get the most fun out of your leatherwork.